question. Number one, what was one memory of Cesar Chavez that really stood out to you during that time?
I started working with Cesar when I was about 20 years old. Right out of, I'd been in college and dropped out of college to join his legal department. But one of the things that I really remember about Cesar was how he really worked with farm workers in terms of communicating with them. He was an extremely good person in terms of communicating his message to them. And just, it was really genuine. He really understood what they were going through and always made it sound like something that was very simple for them to understand, and why what the work he was doing in terms of trying to organize a union was so important for them. So I would always was amazed at how he would do these meetings with workers, because you can have a meeting of 100 workers, and yet in a very simple way, he was talking to each of them in their own way, because he was giving them examples that were very real and very relevant to their daily lives. So that was one of the things I always really appreciated about Cesar, how he talked to workers that way. And then also with us, when we were working for him, we were his staff, and he was always trying to look at us and trying to see if we can improve whatever we're doing. For example, he knew I wanted to be an attorney, so he was constantly asking me, how are your studies going? How are you doing? And those kind of questions, and encouraging me, telling me, you got to keep at it, keep going at it. So those were some of the things that I always found very impressive about Cesar.
Were you treated differently by anybody because of what you supported, or was everyone just very equal and open?
No, unfortunately not. What happened was, because Cesar was actively trying to support creating a union for farm workers. And that was one of the things that the agricultural growers were opposing. And so they did not want their workers to be unionized. They did not want their workers to be organized. So we were constantly in battles with them in terms of doing that. In fact, some of those incidents became very violent. There's a movie called Fighting for Our Lives that lays out what actually happened, the violence that occurred in many of these movements that Cesar was in. But so it was it was not one where people really accepted us what we were doing. It was something that we had to fight for. It was something that we had to try to convince the other side that this was something important for farm workers, and that they had a right to organize. They had a right to sit at a bargaining table with an employer and ask for what was the benefits, wages, those kinds of things. So it's something that they had to fight for very hard.
Yeah. Did you fear for your safety at any point during this time?
Normally, most of the things we were doing, Cesar firmly believed in nonviolence. So everything we did was nonviolent. So whatever marches, whatever rallies, whatever demonstrations we did, it was always based on the concept of nonviolence. He specifically believed in Gandhi's teachings. Gandhi was a person out of India, a leader in India, who organized Indians to overthrow the British Empire in India. And so, but he did it all through nonviolence, and he had teachings of nonviolence. And Cesar was very adamant about everything we did had to be based on nonviolence, and it couldn't be based on any type of violence. And in fact, one of the fasts that he did was specifically to enforce that issue of nonviolence, because he saw a lot of violence being done against farm workers when they were out in picket lines and marching and so forth. So in terms of my safety, the safety that we had, normally we were pretty safe. I mean, we usually had law enforcement that was there at any other events, and we tried to talk to them, let them know that we were there, we're nonviolent, we're not doing anything to destroy the business or affect the business anyway. And a lot of times the officers understood that. They understood that, we had a history that we were not violent. We didn't act in any violent way. So usually the violence that came was from people that came from the outside that were opposing what we were doing, and there were the people that would direct violence against us sometimes.
Okay. So you said Cesar was very or how would you describe Cesar in a way, or how would you just describe him?
I would describe him. He was a very humble person. Um, he sought to better the lives of farm workers, but he also was a very forceful person. In other words, he knew what rights he was fighting for workers, and he would not yield in terms of getting those rights for those workers, in terms of getting fair wages, fair working conditions for workers in the fields. That's what he was asking. That's what he was fighting for. That's what he wanted to do. So, although he was very humble in what he did, he was very forceful in terms of fighting for those rights and making it very clear to anyone he spoke to that he was not going to back down, that farm workers had a right to have good wages, to have good working conditions and good benefits, because they provided basically the vegetables and fruits that the country eats, and therefore they had a right to have those things.
Mm. Let's see. What else did you do for Cesar when you worked with him in his legal department? Yeah.
A lot of the work we did was working with farm workers who had been discriminated against. So, for example, they had either been fired because they were talking about Cesar or talking about getting organized. So we were fighting about getting their jobs back, or they got fired because they were asking for better wages or better working conditions, or they got demoted. They got reduced in terms of their job that they were doing. So those were the type of cases that we would handle at the time with Cesar and work with him in terms of the various companies that we were organizing at the time, and present that evidence to an administrative law judge who would then hear the evidence and then would make a ruling.
Did you work in the fields, or did you work in the fields, and did you get an education when you were younger?
Yes, I worked in the fields at a very young age. My parents, especially my dad, he would take me to work. I must have been about 7, 8 years old when I used to go to work with him. And so we spent a lot of our summers, our weekends working in the field, picking grapes, oranges, all the various types of fruit trees we used to pick, tomatoes, all that stuff. So normally when other people were having the weekends off or vacation, our time was spent working in the fields. But the one thing that my dad was very adamant about, and my mother, was that they wanted us to get an education. So they always pushed us to get an education. When school started, we normally started school right on time, whenever school started. A lot of times, a lot of the farm work kids would not go to school like the first 3 weeks of school because there was still work to be done in the fields. So their parents would keep them working in the fields. My parents would say, no, we're sending you to school because we want you to get an education. And so throughout the whole time that we were kids, both my mom and dad were very adamant about us getting an education and becoming something more with our lives, because they saw that the way to get out of poverty, the way to get out of this situation that we're in, was through education. But then my dad also said, but if you don't want to get educated, then you can always be a farm worker, and farm workers, what farm workers do is important. So it's really up to you. And that's why he really took me to work in the fields, because he wanted to see how hard it was, the work that I done, and what I was going to get into if I didn't want to get an education. And very early on, I said, nope, I don't want to do this. I want to go get an education. And so it was a way of him teaching me that, you got to get an education because you got to improve yourself.
How old were you when you joined Cesar's legal team or legal department?
I was 19 years old. So I was 19 years old, started as a paralegal working in their legal team.
Were you, when you joined his legal department, were you still in school? Were you in college, or were you in high school?
I was in college. I had just started college. I was in my second year in college when one of the attorneys that worked for Cesar came and talked to me when I was in college about coming and working for their legal department and about this apprenticeship program that they were going to be offering in terms of how to become a lawyer. And he really convinced me. He told me, take a year off. The school will give you a year off, because I had to complete a scholarship according to school. And so I went and talked to the financial department. They gave me a year off. So if I wanted to come back in a year, I can come back in a year. And I went for a year and never came back, because I really loved the work that I was doing and really enjoyed it.
While you were in the legal department, Did you work any cases with Cesar Chavez?
Yes, there were several cases that I worked with him. The last case, when he passed away in 1993, was one of the cases I was working with him. In the state of Arizona, they had passed a law that prohibited farm workers from basically boycotting or doing any kind of boycott activities. And they had sued the union for alleged conduct in Arizona, but we had never done anything in Arizona. And they were trying to use conduct that occurred in California to say that was conduct that affected Arizona. So we're in the middle of a trial that we were doing. Cesar was going to be the main witness. I was responsible for prepping him for the trial. And they were suing us for over $5 million in that case. So we were working very hard, and it was in Yuma, Arizona, where we were doing the trial. And unfortunately, that's when Cesar passed away. We were in the middle of that trial.
Did you manage to win the trial?
We lost the trial at the first level, which was in front of the judge that we were arguing the trial from, but we went ahead and appealed it up to the Arizona Court of Appeals, and we won at the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals set aside the judgment, and then eventually the company decided that they weren't going to fight us anymore, and that they were going to go ahead and sign a contract. So we actually got a contract with the company eventually. And I don't know if you understand what a contract is, but what a contract is, it's basically an agreement between the workers and the employer that sets out what are the wages and benefits that workers are going to get. They actually sit down and negotiate, and they say, okay, for example, the employer might say, we want to give you only $9 an hour for wages, and the workers say, no, we want $12 an hour. And then they go back and forth and negotiate. And then ultimately, when they get an agreement, they put it into a contract, and then that's what controls their wages and benefits.
Okay, so this is the last question I have.
Okay.
How much do you think he helped migrant or farm workers and workers in general?
I think the effects Cesar had went beyond just farm workers, because one of the things he did was Cesar always he would always talk to workers in parables. He would always give them stories. And one of the stories he always gave to farm workers, which I always enjoyed, was he talked about this little boy who was in front of a store, and he was selling puppies. And so the puppies were just a few days old. And so this man comes up and asks the little boy, he says, how much do you want for your little puppies? And he goes, I'm selling them for $5 each. And the man goes, nah, that's too expensive. I'll come back later. And the man walked away and he goes, I'll come back in a week, because nobody's going to buy him any of those puppies because he's selling them too expensively. So a week later, the man comes back and he asks the little boy, how much are your puppies? And he goes, they're $20 each. And the man goes, wait a minute, last week you were selling them for $5. What happened? And he goes, because they opened their eyes. Does now have their eyes open. And so the parable that Cesar was trying to tell workers was, our job as working for you, for farm workers, is we need to educate you so that you can open your eyes and see all the benefits, all the things that are out there that you can do for yourself and your families. So once we organize workers in terms of organizing in their branch where they were working at, a lot of that would spill over to them organizing at their schools. For example, we would see workers going to their schools and saying, hey, we want our kids to have this, we want our kids to have these other things, and organize around schools. They start organizing their communities where they say, hey, we want a stoplight at this particular street because it's not safe. We want sidewalks in front of our house. We want these things. So the organizing that we taught them just to organize at their particular ranch grew out to them seeing that they could do it in many other things that they did. The other thing that was very important is because we would educate them in terms of what was important for their children too. A lot of these farm workers that we organized, a lot of their kids went on to going to college and becoming lawyers, becoming congressmen, becoming representatives in their city councils and things of that nature. So we saw a lot that with a lot of these farm workers that, again, once they opened their eyes and they saw what the possibilities were that they can do and how they can do those things, that Cesar was so adamant about educating them about those things. They also turned around and started educating their kids and making sure their kids got an education and got that. So again, I think that was an effect that Cesar had with not just the farm workers, but other people that saw what he was doing. They also wanted to do the same thing.
I want to thank you for your time, and
I want to thank you for letting me come and talk to you.
I think this will be very helpful to anyone who wants to learn more about him.
Yes.
And people who want to know his legacy.
Yes. Thank you, Dominic.
You're welcome.